Hey PAX, I'm Tanya X Short, the captain of Kitfox Games, and I'm here hosting a panel on procedural generation. What is it good for in 2020? I'm going to let all of my panelists introduce themselves and then we'll start discussing. Who wants to start? Maybe Tyler?
Me? Oh, great. Yeah, I'm Tyler Sigman, co-founder of Red Hook, and I kind of do design there. And we make a game called Dark's Dungeon that has been out an unbelievable amount of years now. The time passed. We're working on Dark's Dungeon 2. And so there's, of course, a little bit of prop gen in those games, although not nearly as much as some of the other games that are being mentioned here. And yeah, I think I'm interested in the subject just because I think it boils down to prop gen allows you to make a game that like you want to play yourself and you don't know all the secrets. And I like that from a design perspective of being able to surprise myself even. Who's
I'll
next?
go. I'm Jason Grinblat. I'm the co-founder of Freehold Games, and we make a roguelike, science fantasy roguelike called Caves of Qud. And before that, we also released a smaller roguelike called Sproggywood. And yeah, making games that are surprising to us really resonates to me. I mean, I think that's really where we started getting into the roguelike genre and kind of where our fascination with procedural generation was born. And yeah, our games are very heavily procedural, but not entirely. No game is entirely procedural, but we like to do a lot of handwritten stuff too. So the blending of those two things is where a lot of interesting stuff happens.
We'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Tarn Adams, another co-founder of Bay 12 Games, and we do a game Dwarf Fortress. I guess in terms of how procedural it is, fairly procedural. And yeah, same again. My brother and I have been writing games mostly by ourselves before we got online. So this idea that we do it to surprise ourselves again is the whole deal for us, because we were just sitting there playing a game with just us and a few friends, and we had to play them over and over. And so a script just wouldn't do it.
My name is Andy Nguyen, and I'm the project lead and designer for Industries of Titan, which is a cyberpunk simulation strategy game. And I work for Brace Yourself Games, which is known for Crypt of the Necrodancer and Cadence of Hyrule. Those games are heavily procedural in their content generation, whereas Industries of Titan, we're going with like a hybrid approach where some of the world building content is generated, and but a lot of kind of like the encounters with the enemies are authored, and I can go into that sort of like why we went that mixed hybrid route later.
Hi, I'm Adam Saltsman. I also am a co-founder. I co-founded Finji, and the two kind of like heaviest procedural games I worked on were one of the kind of early endless runner games called Canabalt, which depended entirely on procedural generation in order to function, and that was kind of specifically like reactive, like wanting something that was like, oh, the player's been doing this, so we're going to react by doing this. And then last year, I don't really know how time works anymore, but very recently we put out a game called Overland, which had a lot of procedural elements in it also. But also some kind of hand placed and some kind of scripted stuff, and a lot of work on trying to make those things blend together in a way that felt nice. And I like procgen a lot, even though I think our next project, when we get around to it, probably is going to have very, very little of it. I'm ready for a break from that for a little while. But the thing that I like about it is something I like about a lot of other game systems, which is like emergent. It's these emergent, surprising things. So I think even if the next project, if we don't try to get that out of procedurally generated sort of structures in the game, we'll be looking to get it out of something else, because that's the good stuff for me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of us have sort of walked this line of authored and procedurally generated. And I know for Moon Hunters, it was hard for me to get away from authoring, especially for characters. I felt like it was very difficult to plan out a system that wouldn't take me years and years, like, 10 years of Dwarf Fortress type development. I would also produce interesting conversations and choices to make with characters. But I don't know, like you mentioned that you very deliberately chose some things to be authored. Adam and Andy and Jason in particular. Do you have any thoughts on why you did that, or what benefits that has?
One of the things that we did that was, I think, the most that was like a pretty early choice is to have sort of our, I guess I want to call them like boss encounters, but these kind of like, difficulty spikes and milestones throughout the game, having those be more hand authored than other areas of the game, because it was a place where we felt like where we could generalize a lot of our kind of board game-ish rules out to make your kind of average encounters work just the way we wanted. That trying to make a completely random system that would really specifically like isolate and try to reproduce kind of very specific, like more specific puzzles. At some point it was like, where do we draw the line between we just sit down and put the trees where we want them and get on with our life, versus do I also teach the computer to do this the way I kind of would do it? And also there was like a pragmatism component of it, but there also, it felt like there was a risk component where if the computer did a bad job of those specific encounters, because they're these kind of precious spiked moments, that was a place where failures on the part of the computer would stick out more and would feel worse for the player, I think.
Yeah, I have a sort of, I have two reasons, and one of them is very much in line with what Adam just said, which is that, I think sometimes when you're a beginner approaching procgen, there's this idea that it's easier than handwriting, or that you're going to get like more bang for your buck by procgenning. And often at the scale, you save time, right? Yeah, there's a great quote. I think it might be Kate Cutler. It's like, procgen gets you double the content at double the time or something. It's often the case. It's often at the scales you want to do it. It's really hard. It's sometimes just easier to go in and like handwrite something the way you want it. It's just like, it'll actually be the like more pragmatic method, even though it kind of goes against the marketing grain of what procgen is used for. But the second reason is that we found that having handwritten sort of scaffolding really helps to contextualize the procedural content in powerful ways. It kind of gives you a scaffold in order to understand a lot of the randomness you're seeing. And that's important to us because, we were developing this game, Caves of Qud, which has a very kind of strange science fantasy setting. We drop you in this very like bizarre, exotic world and want you to make sense of it. And a lot of the procedural content you're seeing and like the way it's structured so that you're exploring this possibility space, I think a lot of it would not really be as meaningful or make as much sense without the really like strongly voiced handwritten bits that kind of position you and situate.
Can you give a very specific example of like what an authored bit to you would be that's like a useful contextualizing element?
Okay, they come in all sorts of forms, but one that comes to mind is that we have a lot of just handwritten quests in the game. Like, we actually also have procedural quests, but a lot of the game is really built around these handwritten quests that sort of like, it lets you, I like to say words are fast. Words are so fast. If you have an NPC talking to you, or if you have like, if you do world building, we have a lot of text in our game. We can like just convey a lot of the voice and the tone and the atmosphere of the world through like, interesting cultural encounters and dialogue. And then when you go off and you see like a procgen creature, or if you see like a weird like space dungeon, like sci-fi futuristic space that has a lot of these like modules pulled into it that, we don't have control over because we're doing it procgen, you kind of have a better sense, oh, I'm here because like this NPC that I have a relationship with now told me to go to this place. I kind of have a sense of what their values are and what is valued in the world.
What's an example of a written quest versus a generated quest? Like a written quest that you think would have been very difficult to generate?
Oh, well,
because we've seen a lot of examples of generated quests out there, but for people who aren't familiar with procgen design, they might wonder, well, why not generate, more interesting quests?
And if someone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I had sort of like maybe like a simultaneous question of like, kind of for everybody too, is like, how much of this is things that are supposed to be recognizable and familiar are pretty hard to get away with in procgen, and stuff that's weirder is kind of like a little bit easier to get away with in procgen. So if you're supposed to be talking to a regular person, that generating that
in the real world.
Yeah.
That actually aligns with kind of the how I've separated what is authored and generated in Titan. So we generate a lot of the natural environments because like the variations that you see from as a result of procgen, it's kind of built into the world and the lore that they're kind of weird. They're supposed to present like a feeling of an atmosphere of mystery and kind of to invoke curiosity. So anomalies with the procgen kind of are at service with the lore. And the thing that we end up authoring are all of the combat vessels in the game. You can go into an interior view, just like FTL, where you can see the inside. And since vehicles in present day are authored with like an intent, some sort of design intent by humans, we wanted to convey that same sort of messaging. So the current kind of enemies that you fight right now are rebels, and they manufacture their ships sort of like with the scraps that they have available to them, and so they need the layouts need to kind of communicate an idea of like a lack of professionalism that they wouldn't have because they're like lacking resources. And it's probably possible to come up with a generation algorithm to actually make that our desires like occur that way, but like Adam and Jason said, it was just a matter of time, and like it's just not practical to like invest all that time to kind of emulate what we can just kind of do manually pretty quickly. And as soon as we want to create another faction that has sort of like a different mentality on how to author ships, you'd have to just create a new model for that.
This is my like I'm really biased because this is like one of my procgen bones to pick, is like if you have to procedurally place a weird alien plant, you can like just pick some random coordinates and move on with your next task during the day. And as soon as you have to like place a street light somewhere, now, I mean, that's a week-long project or something. You need a whole system of priority masks. You need an electric grid. You need to know how close are the other streetlights. Like suddenly there's this whole cascade of like lived uncanny valley stuff that you suddenly have to try to accommodate. And it's one of those things where suddenly it's like, well, I know where it's supposed to go. I'm just having like a very hard time building up a system of simulated cultural values that can reproduce the same effect, kind of.
Tarn, have you run into anything like that? I don't know, maybe.
All of it, yeah. I mean, that's no, that's exactly the problem. I mean, our towns are lackluster right now, and I'm sure in Caves of Qud they had the same difficulties when they're generating their villages to get central structures placed or certain frills placed. I was thinking this whole time about the Sultan quests in Caves of Qud, because they're an example of a generated quest that is far more interesting than what you typically see, and outshines in certain ways some of the handwritten content, not all.
For those of us that haven't encountered,
some of that's great.
Can you describe what a Sultan quest is? Yeah.
I really should not. I should let Jason do it.
No. It's a gift to another designer to not.
Oh, do you want to hear me? Do you want to hear me talk about it?
Yeah, of course.
Now, this is the caveat here is that I've read a chapter in a book that Jason but I promised I wouldn't play his game again until it was done. So I haven't actually seen these in action, except in demonstrations and so forth. But basically, the idea is that I believe there are 6 or so of these ancient rulers of this sort of, as he said, a sort of science fiction world that has thousands of years of history behind it. And it generates several interesting events that are tied together about what these characters might have done. They might have offended one culture, rescued somebody from another, found some object, and gone and done this or that out in the world. But that object would be real, or one of the sites mentioned would be real in the world, and you could go find it. But it'd be contextualized in terms of these clues that you can find about the civilization. So it's not like, kill 7 giant rats. It's instead something that's tied into the entire world, and everything that you can do with that object or with that place. And as Adam says, quite a bit of work to get that done, right? You have to commit to it and make it a centerpiece of your game. And it was, and by all accounts, successful, even if I haven't experienced it myself. And I think that's, it was kind of, in terms of just balancing time and how cool you can make something, whether you handwrite something, whether you do it, it's just these decisions that you have to make. It just another kind of point of interest that I thought of. But I've lost my threads now.
I'm not even kidding. I had a Steam notification pop up from a friend, and they're playing Caves of Qud. And I actually thought, I was like, wait, is that one of you guys? And you're booting it right now to check it out? And I remember who the name was. And so there, hopefully you either just got another sale or they're just a diehard fan. On our game, I really like what Jason said about the kind of scaffolding, because I think of it like connective, like our hand authored stuff is like the pillars, and then the connective tissue is the random stuff, or armature and clay, if we want to use the sculpture analogy. And I think that it depends on what your intent is from a top level design standpoint. But I think like with our game, for example, we want you to have to experience certain key story beats, but it's not a scripted game. We just have a few key key moments, but it's very light. And I think like the interesting thing that I still am kind of surprised and happy with is that a lot of people that play Darkest Dungeon feel like they had an immersive story experience. And that's very interesting, because we're actually very light on, we have like a setup cinematic, and then we have like narration, and we force you into certain boss battles, but there's very, very little scripted stuff compared to say like a Witcher or a Divinity, where, Divinity is really cool in that there's lots of room for random shit to happen, but it's very highly curated, which is awesome. And I think like, we don't do a lot of that, but people come out with that experience. And so that's just something like, I don't want to say totally accidental, but it's not like we knew exactly how we could get that done. And I think we're actually learning from the players in that regard of like how they experienced the first game to try to make sure that we don't lose that. Because I think like we'd like to be very narrative, feel heavy, but actually light touch, and I think that's where procedural is really advantageous, because like, it allows the player to kind of have that experience, but without the hand-authored stuff to kind of bound you. Like it's almost like that Disneyland ride where you drive and it actually keeps you on the rail, but you feel like you have a little bit of agency. And I think like our game, we're trying to figure out how wide to make that track, but it's the hand-authored stuff that brings you back to make sure that they see the cool mountain vista at the right time, or the lake or whatever it is on their little drive.
Yeah, I think something some people have mentioned, Adam brought it up first, was sort of the difference between like procgen that's like simulating a system or a complex interaction versus a procedure that's primarily reactive. So it's looking for certain player behaviors and then trying to respond to that and make a specific experience based on what that player is doing, which I think was most famously, or maybe, I don't know, it's sort of coined by the Left 4 Dead director AI, which it didn't have that many options of things it could do. All it could do was place monsters, really, and have the characters do their voice acting barks. But it felt very immersive because it was so reactive, even though it was very limited. I don't know if there is a clear line between them, or as a designer, if one of them is more interesting to you. But I know I've sort of fantasized about primarily simulationist, even though maybe I would get more bang for buck if I focused on the reactive. And Boyfriend Dungeon is neither. The Boyfriend Dungeon, the dungeons are just, the standard Diablo, like let's put some dungeons together with some stuff in them. But yeah, when I think about characters, like we made Bad Cupid, which is like two characters talking to each other, and it's just trying to simulate people flirting. And it looks completely ridiculous. It's two AIs flirting in nonsense, but it's still simulationist versus, and it's decentering the player. Like the world is just sort of doing its thing. But whenever I sort of daydream in the shower about procedural generation, I think about reactive stuff. So I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I did 2 reactive games, and it was really fun, and it was really, it ended up influencing Overland a lot. Overland is simulationist and not reactive, with very, very, very few exceptions. There's like 2 or 3 places where we were like, no, this one component of this one thing is going to be reactive because it fixes problems, whatever, we'll get on with it. Because simulation stuff is just, it's so interesting on its own. But the reactive thing felt like, it felt interesting because it's one of these things where if you don't have procgen, it's really hard to have it at all. Like procgen is this tool which enables, I think, reactivity that goes beyond like dynamic difficulty adjustment stuff. The thing that ended up being interesting for me was, Canabalt was like a one-dimensional reactive game. It was just like, oh, you're going faster, the building should be farther apart because that's cool, your jumps are longer. Capsule and Overland, both, even though one is reactive and one is simulationist, both of them we started isolating more and more and more that we wanted to use this stuff for drama more than for actual dynamic difficulty adjustment. So things like Capsule is like a little bit of you're like a submarine or an escape pod or something, and you're mostly trying to make sure you have enough electricity, enough oxygen. And the reactive component of it is very, very, very light in that if you have a shitload of electricity and oxygen, it doesn't give you any place to get that. And as you kind of like roll along through the wilderness, as your levels start to drop, the odds that you might find some start to go up. And then there's like a big spike down at like 5% or something like that, where you're more likely to kind of like, oh, we barely made it. The risks are like your basic DDA stuff, like, oh, people can game this system. They're trying to min-max it, so they deliberately put their energy at only 5%, and now they can get the max power up and speed run the thing. So like it requires a little bit of like design work still. Like I don't think any of it's freebies. Like we let the player run out of electricity more than we let them run out of oxygen, because electricity you can still jumpstart and keep going, where oxygen is a true fail state, for example. And oxygen runs out a lot slower than electricity. So you still have to do like some real board game design around it. But the idea that you could have, because your game has the capacity to be generative in the first place, the idea that you could, from a player perspective, think about drama and think about close calls and kind of gently nudge things in a way that's deeper than just enemy placement, toward like kind of because like the promise of the Left 4 Dead stuff was always like, we're thinking about pacing, for example, like, oh, things got too hot for too long, let's cut it off, and like, ooh, like things are like have been too chill for too long, there should be a big surprise. Like that stuff is so attractive to me as a designer in general, and something that I would like try to do in a hand scripted level. But the dream of like, oh, well, we have all these generative elements anyway. Maybe we could just like, what do we have that lives outside of real pass-fail difficulty stuff that really like has a cool positive impact on sort of players' emotions or the drama of the situation that they're in? And is that something where we could have reactivity participate in a way that won't break the game, will elevate the experience, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about homogeneity really when I think about reactivity, because everything, like if it always dials back when it gets to certain thresholds, and it always amps up when it gets below certain thresholds. It's not just, I guess, about gaming the system, but just that when you we always think about sort of emergent narrative player stories. It's like we just want people talking to each other, and if they always say the same thing, then they just will stop. We have this problem kind of with I'd say the most reactive part of Dwarf Fortress is just siege triggers, right? You have a certain wealth level, you have a certain population, and it's going to start amping up what happens. And so every fortress has the same story. And now the players call the items that they pick up from the goblins that attack them goblinite. It's ore that you gather from their weapons by melting it down. And now it's just kind of considered background radiation in the game, right? It's just like, oh yes, the goblinite will come on year 4 or something like that, right? And then you can prepare for it, and it cheapens the stories in a way. Although it does provide, and it was just an easy out for us to provide a certain level of excitement. Why are you building these traps? Why are you building these weapons? So you can kind of start with it too. And then my dream, kind of the opposite way, instead of dreaming about how to get reactivity to work, is how to replace my broken reactivity with simulations that can get and then you have to deal with the whole sort of geopolitical model and so forth. But it's arguably will be more interesting if you're sending out diplomats and making allegiances and getting things timed just right. But again, as previously said, there's another year of your life or whatever.
It's like you have to start simulating what in the goblin culture led to that moment where they decided we need to attack the dwarf fortress, as opposed to we're going to spawn goblins coming in to attack without a reason at this point.
Sorry. Just one quick point about that is that leads to the whole other branch of this procedural conversation, which is exposing what you're doing, because we already do that. It just they don't know. The player's not like, the leaders do have personalities. It makes all these roles. They make decisions about when they're going to come. That does kind of work against that reactivity and more toward the simulation side. But no one knows that that's going on.
Yeah, like we were.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that the system for the boss naming in the Shadows of Mordor series, like it was pretty simple, but it was very transparently reactive, and so it made people feel really good about this monster that's it's extremely narcissistic in a way, that we are telling the player, like, you are the center of the world, everything depends on you. And now this monster is obsessed with you, and everything about his life is because of things you've done. But it was very fulfilling to people, because it's so rare to see a world genuinely change around you in a way that isn't scripted by a designer in a closet somewhere that's hiding behind the curtain. And so I wonder if the next step is, like, if it gets even more complicated, how do you make even more transparency without it suddenly being a screen of text, which is something that Dwarf Fortress has accepted as part of its player experience, but is now we're looking at UI and things, so it's exciting. Yeah, for anybody who doesn't know, I feel like I have to mention Dwarf Fortress is coming to Steam. Like, Tarn didn't say anything about that, but yeah, definitely go look on Steam and wishlist Dwarf Fortress if you're interested in checking out weird generated cultures. But yeah, anybody have any other thoughts about transparency or reactivity?
I had a couple of things that were tickling my brain. One is, I think there's a really cool reactivity as acknowledgement, as opposed to reactivity as a predictable, gameable, nudging the system, I think is so attractive. Like the idea that you made a mess and wrecked this house, and now it's become overgrown and it's known as the house that you wrecked, you big jerk. Those are reactive generative systems. Absolutely. Those are all the things that you would want out of it. But I feel like those feel really you can see the roots of them in a lot of ways. It's not like an unseen hand of director. It's your hand. It feels more like your hand as player. You did this, even though it is unseen hand of director still kind of putting this together for you.
One thing that we're trying to experiment with on Titan is that the game will like kind of evaluate how any mistakes that you're making, and then you have access to like these specialists in each of the game systems, like a power system specialist, a pollution management specialist, like a people management specialist, etc. And based on like criteria that we can kind of define, they will then, you have the option to like contact them. I think Kings and Castles does something like this too. And so it's like they go, oh, look, I see that you're struggling with power, and I've identified that you're missing like these key components in your system. Have you tried building those? And that, I think that's I don't know if that falls exactly in line with like what you were talking about, Adam, but what you had just said made me think of that.
I think that's a type of reactivity. Yeah, I think like, because when you think about it, I think reactivity or like responsiveness is very much a property of simulation, right? Like a simulation is dynamic in that way. I think we're rightly kind of intuitively drawing a distinction between that type of reactivity and then a reactivity that sort of operates by a different logic that almost like if you're looking at it through a simulationist perspective feels a little cheaty, right? Like it's doing something on top of the simulation to facilitate the experience. And there's some research that I always like to invoke in conversations about procgen. I know some of you are familiar with it. This researcher, James Ryan, had like made this point that kind of the good feeling that we get about like experiencing an emergent narrative that's coming out of a simulation is the way it operates is a lot like nonfiction operates. Like we're actually experiencing some of the same joys we experience when we read about strange things that happened in the real world. And that's because they're bound by this set of rules, whether the rules are simulative or real physical systems. And that sort of like what can come out of that is more exciting or delightful in some way, right? And so I think there are ways in which you could put reactivity in your game, which may serve the purposes of your game, but may violate that sort of principle. And there are ways I think you could build in intervention or reactivity or like a conversation with the simulation that are more, I think, like we could say authentic, or you could say more like that abide by the logic of the simulation, right? In interesting ways. I think there's all sort of fascinating design space there to think about ways in which you can sort of intervene in the simulation on the terms of the simulation.
I think a big thing about simulations and about like real life events and actual history, and like one of the things that they teach you when you go like, I want to learn about history, and they're like, okay, you have to radically reconsider how you think about history, because history is like the idea that there were a shared series of events that transpired, and there are different stories about those events. And that seems like a core simulation joy to me, is like, okay, a bunch of events happened, and there's not a single specific, really distinct narrative that you must draw from those events. And so like, I'm curious that like, I wonder if there's like a litmus test of like, oh, I wonder if this is cool reactivity. Can this only really tell exactly one story? Or is this more of like a thing that happened in the world and now like you could interpret it in different ways kind of thing? Well, as opposed to like a lot of the reactive stuff that I've done is like, let's heighten drama right now. The end, which is really like, that's really trying to do mainly one specific thing.
Well, and it's the kind of like the transparency angle is also a good point to consider, because like amping up drama and pacing, if that's transparent, it actually makes the experience less interesting. Whereas in the simulationist reactivity, when it's something within the simulation that's reacting, making that more transparent makes it more interesting. And so it is sort of this boundary between, I don't know what we're considering good or bad, but like a more simple reactivity, director reactivity versus world reactivity.
That's what I think is really interesting, because there's a spectrum there where I don't think, like, it's kind of our innate impulse, I think, as game players and game designers to, oh, that's good, let's push that further all the way to the end. And I think that the interesting part here is that you can go too far on either end. So for example, like, most movies have the same structure, even to the point of, that around this page in the screenplay, this should happen, and around this page in the screenplay, this should happen. But the interesting thing is that if you get too innovative, it doesn't land as well. Like you could say, oh, I'm not going to do a 3-act structure. I'm not going to have an act 2 climax and a denouement. I'm going to go crazy. And it just ends up feeling like a crazy, like experimental art house play that most people aren't going to really connect with. And so I think that's true here too, where like what Tarn was saying about the homogeneity and you were saying about predictability is, you know, there's a little bit of a problem where like once you played enough Left 4 Dead, you're like, the tank's going to come soon. Or Vermintide, which is extremely well done, by the way, and I think it's an amazing game. And that's just part of the rules of the game that you learn. But I think that if you go too far at the other end and say, fuck it, we're not going to structure at all, you might just never have that period of drama. But if you go too far unstructured, it's scripted. And you realize that, wait, why are we procgening at all? We should just script the exact experience we want you to have. And I think like that unsolvable, at least to me, it's not one of those equations that has one solution. And I think that's what's so interesting, because what you do and learn on one game and it works perfectly may not apply to your next game. And so I think like that mix, like you're making a stew where that mix is different of like how much to react and how much to just purely simulate and leave to the RNG gods. I like that it's not clear. Like,
yeah, does anybody have any I don't know, things they've seen lately that have been interesting or surprising? I mean, we're in 2020. Procgen has been sort of a topic among designers for a long time now. Tarn and I have actually co-edited 2 different books about procedural generation. There's Procedural Generation in Game Design and Procedural Storytelling in Game Design by CRC Press, if anyone wants to look them up. But it feels like if I were to co-edit a book like that every year, there would be new games to include that are really important and really interesting. Just recently, I saw there's a new murder mystery generated game that's coming out called The Magister by a very small team in Malaysia. And I'm curious to see how that goes, because murder mysteries are famously difficult, even though people keep trying to generate them. But yeah, any other thoughts on what's going on right now with ProcGen, or what you'd like to see next?
I think there's like this movement that I'm noticing happening, like to some degree. I think it's not yet infiltrated games like to such a degree yet, but there's kind of this movement from a lot of thinking of ProcGen in terms of generating and designing into curating, because we now have a lot of techniques that are able to produce like content at scales that is kind of unimaginable to us even a few years ago. So like I'm thinking of stuff like GPT-2 or GPT-3, the neural net deep learning, text generation engine, and then AI Dungeon in particular is an instance of a game that is built on top of that. And I think there's a lot of really interesting discussions to be had here, because I think this is a technology that is there's a lot of interesting design space to explore. There's also a lot of interesting ethical space to explore, I think, because the way these algorithms are working is that they're kind of like laundering human creativity in ways that really obscure and rearrange, and sometimes don't rearrange and kind of just plagiarize in ways we don't fully understand yet. But yet we have like a sort of a narrative around them where like, oh, look what the machine generated. Like being completely sort of obtuse to the human output that is behind it, right? And as that starts to become something that I think more games are going to be interested in trying to leverage, I think those are questions we want to be asking and preparing ourselves for.
I remember the first time I pulled up like Talk to Transformer or whatever, and I was just like, this is hilarious. This is so cool. Like I find this, and I personally find it deeply compelling, because like everything almost makes sense. And that's thrilling to me. Like that's part of the fun of ProcGen is like, oh, it almost made sense. That's so cool. But then like 6, 7, 8 clicks in, it's like you start going like, oh, that's crazy. That's another super racist one. All right, well, whatever. All right, like give me a couple more. I'm not copy pasting that to anybody. That's terrible. And yeah, a big part of that is like, oh, this is like sucking up this big block of like U.S. news is one of the things it was trained on, and that's this like deeply political, like corporate state institution, and now the things that it thinks in aggregate are being expressed by this like what do you call it? Liability displacement exhibiting machine thing. And yeah, I definitely hesitate to think about like, we should have like computer aided level generation. I can just kind of, tell it, give me like a Paul Rudd computer, give me 10 of these. This is great. No, these 9 are no good. Let's keep this one though. I like this one. Like, I'm probably gonna have to go through there and like check for swastikas or something. Like there's gonna be like a human element, or like, oh, the level generator was trained on like Israeli suburban warfare. And so this like cool ruined town is like based on this like pretty explicit set of like profoundly brutal kind of real world warfare tactics. But it looks really cool. So like how do I connect with those tools that I do want very badly? I don't necessarily want to push every vertex around on my own anymore.
I liked like stuff I've seen is that game Noita or whatever, the pixel like simulating fire and water and all that. And I thought it was a cool innovation on, like, people have been doing procedural games of that viewpoint for a long time and done very well. And it was neat to couple some procedural gen with the systems interacting in such kind of a, pixel by pixel way. It was cool. So that one was I enjoyed. And as far as future looking, I think there's room to explore procedural rules. So I think there's like a lot of procedural content, and we're continuing to innovate there. But like one example I can think of is, like Rogue Legacy, which is coming back. But it's cool that not only is the content generated, but the rules of how your character plays and operates change. And, there's a storyline there. And I don't really have something specific, but I'm curious whether, if we stop looking at just content and also look at like, is there such a thing as like procedural rules that dramatically change how you would interpret and experience that content? So.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, we've experimented in some projects with like procedural tech trees, like completely creating them procedural resources that you would find on like some location, and then would glue it into the tech tree and then alter recipes and so forth. And you can do anything you want. You really can. And it's just like the issue there is balance, right? Is it easy to kind of make a sort of min-max thing that it can live between and not screw up the game too much? Very, very hard. That's one of the it's difficult. It's like trying to come up with a chess rule set that doesn't suck. I mean, we've kind of homed in on a good one or several good ones over a very long time, but just having a computer try to do it. I mean, it's interesting. There's all kinds of research into machine evaluation of the rule sets and stuff, and it's I mean, it's intriguing. I think people should, try and mess around with that a little bit. I think that even the failures will be kind of cool looking.
I wonder if like some of this stuff has been kind of like avoided or counterintuitive because it's like relatively abstract compared to like super spatial generation. And that being such like a one-to-one, like part of the fun of computer magic is like, I typed a for loop and now there's a level on the screen and I can see it. It's a 2D grid and there's different colors and it's arranged just so. And like, like prototypes that we've done internally of like, oh, there should be like a conversation thing. Okay, spy party, but there's no guns. It's just barbs and conversation. And it becomes so profoundly abstract so fast. And you just get lost in your own head and just like
I was already just thinking about like the procedurally generated resources Tarn was talking about, and like at some point you end up with like, okay, the player's just looking for the one that's kind of heavy and durable and the one that's kind of flexible and conductive, and like at some point they're just memorizing other words. When is there really that much meaning between that and like steel versus copper or whatever it is?
You create meaning. It's just like the Qud sultans, right? You create meaning around them by adding, interlocking them with other systems, where they're found, what side effects they have, I mean, if steel is radioactive, you think about it differently. But it's still very useful, right? You're just not going to use it for your skyscrapers anymore, but you'll find other uses for it, or some uses that still can be maintained. But
Andy,
yeah,
it looked like Andy had something to say a little bit ago.
Oh, I was just thinking about thinking of things that I would like to see procedurally generated at some point, and it would be nice if we could find a way to procedurally generate player behavior. And my reason for this is, I think there's like a large percentage of gamers that play online competitive games, and my time with those over the many years is there's a subsection of those players that I think they enjoy the feeling of like creating conflict with other players in a not so positive way. The problem is like, because of negative bias, the net outcome of those interactions is actually an overall detriment to like the global human happiness. And so if we could find a way to generate like player behavior so that people who are desire to kind of like troll and cause harm to others could do it so to like a robot, we could like have them do it in isolation, kind of like satiate their impulses, and then reduce the sort of like global impact of like these negative
So
online
you
interactions.
want to generate sheep for the wolves, basically.
It's bot jail, and I think these sort of exist in some games. I think where instead of like muting or banning players, you like kind of like gently slide them off onto a server full of nothing.
A shadow ban.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like you could even do it to like forums, and so if people wanted to just troll forums, they could troll a bot forum.
Yeah.
I feel bad for these bots.
Twitter.
For those bots.
Have that too.
Yeah, all of Twitter is bots now. I don't know if there's any humans left.
Sadly, Andy, I think the easier side of that problem to solve is put people in a closed community of friendly bots. It's like, so the idealistic side is what you said, which is, can we just take the assholes out and stick them somewhere else? And then like the unfortunate, unsatisfying side would be, because I think about this with collectible card games online and stuff. I'm like I really want to play more of this game. I just don't want to play humans. I'm tired of playing humans because humans are just, like, all multiplayer games are really interesting in theory until they get ruined by humanity, you know, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, so maybe you want a procgen layer where, like, if you type mean things, then whoever you're playing gets a fresh procgen facelift of also being mean back to you. But if you're playing in your like interactions online are kind, then your opponents get like a kind like procgen facelift layer, and then that comes back to you. And now everybody is kind of like dynamically funneled into echo chambers that they feel positive about.
And then at what point do you even just not bother having multiplayer, really?
That's worked for me too. It's good.
Yeah. Does anybody want to talk about some procgen they've been working on lately, or I don't know, something they've been thinking about working on, or anything like that? Tyler, you mentioned there was maybe some procgen stuff going on in Darkest Dungeon 2. You might be able to hint at.
Yeah, I've been trying to thread the needle on this because we've shared so little. But I think if I return to just what I said about DD1, which is we're really love that procgen did a lot of the lifting, but we just anchored it, you know, with enough hand, you know, which seems like everyone's saying, so it's not novel to our situation. But I think that like some of our pillars in Darkest Dungeon are, we want you to have those unexpected experiences, and we feel that if we control too heavily, then we run the risk of not allowing for those emergent, you know, real interesting moments to happen. And I think you know, the flip side of that is crazy series of shit happens that drive people insane, you know, with RNG. But we like that mix, even though sometimes you live by the sword, die by the sword. And so I don't think we want to get away from that in DD2 at all. We love we don't want to have so many rules that there's not room for the players to totally find shit we didn't think of. You know, it's all, I guess, pretty standard prop gen emergent stuff, but I guess it's just still really on our mind, because despite how much we get lauded for the feel and atmosphere, and we want to make sure that a lot of that lifting is still done by like stuff that's actually kind of has elements of randomness. So I hate to be so vague, but it's, you know, I think the mix and the feel we want to retain. So, but it's not super easy to do even when you've done it before, because, you know, a game's experience is the mix of all these different things interacting. And so, you know, it's funny to be able to look back on something we created and try to use that as a baseline and be like, oh, we totally violated our own rule there. You know, it's almost like a third party could have made that game and we're trying to learn from it and, you know, cite it in our own discussions of things that worked and things that didn't. But yeah, I just kind of want to say, like, we still rely on that, because we're not a large company that's set up with, you know, 6 writers and eight level scripters, which, you know, I've been super impressed with companies that do that and do it really, really well, but it's never been our strength. So more of the same is all I can say. Yeah.
I look forward to my adventurers being inspired or destroyed in a moment of truth. That's a good time. Anybody else have something they're working on that maybe they can speak to a little bit more specifically than
Yeah,
Tyler?
I'm sorry. I tried, but I can't.
I know. Thank you. Anyone?
I mean, I'll you know, we're still making Caves of Qud. It's a big project. We're hoping to release it sometime next year. I could talk, like, something interesting happened recently. Part of by virtue of it being such a long-lived project that I like found really interesting, which is that this is something I've talked with Tarn about, how like a really good method for starting to think about how you might want to procedurally generate is to kind of first-hand sketch out the sort of what you think of as the successful, you know, story, like emergent narratives that might come out of your systems, and do a few of them and try to like think about what systems you can like use to interpolate between them. And so, you know, I did for these Sultan histories, you know, we generate history around these ancient rulers. I did that. I had sketched out these histories. Then we built this generator that kind of generated histories in that form. Now that was like few years ago. Now, more recently, we were developing this dungeon where I was handwriting the history of the last Sultan. And what I found myself doing was the sort of inverse, where I was like handwriting to kind of in the style of the generator, because the generator had become so like,
cool.
It had developed such a strong voice, and like it had lived in the game and people were familiar with it, and I became more familiar with it. And I was using it as inspiration to then handwrite histories that were kind of mirroring it. And it was this weird like full circle moment where on a long enough lived project, the procedural generation, like, yeah, like you're coming back to imitating it instead of vice versa. And that just opened up some possibilities in my mind as to like interesting. I can imagine all sorts of ways in which we might want to try to imitate a generator and have fun with that.
It's like a reverse Turing test, like you're trying to pass as a computer.
Right, exactly.
For stylistic reasons.
Which is kind of what Spy Party is, right, in its own way. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tarn, what I don't know, I mean, you've been talking about your magic system forever, and I know you're not allowed to work on it because...
Well, that's the thing. I mean, what have I been working on recently? Well, I've been working for the boss. The boss tells me what to do, and I work on stuff.
Don't say that, people think you're serious, and then I'm going to get some crazy emails. Come on.
Yeah, no, we're doing our best, but yeah, no, it's just cool. It's like kind of in this vein of procedural tech trees and things. I mean, we'd like to make procedural myth and magic systems. Of course, we've been talking about this for 4 years now, something like that, and we're getting there. After the Steam release and after some other things, then there'll be, you know, we're getting started on this. And I think the thing that's going to be sort of a pressure release valve on this, and it's good to find these when you're making procedural systems, is that people expect magic to fundamentally unbalance the world, right? And so we're actually not planning to try and balance the magic systems too much. If for some reason the cold magic that it generates because the myth involved a lot of glaciers and things and so forth, and then it generates magic systems based around that, and so everything is based on cold people, more powerful people born knowing how to do cold things, etc. And there's no fire to be found, etc. That's cool. You want the world to then be cold dominated. You want everything to be about that. And at the same time, we were hoping to get in the ability to also fundamentally change systems that had already been generated, so that you could try and sort of topple this order if you want. And that would give you a structure around that and a kind of a goal if you're the sort of person that likes to mess with things, then it would allow you to think about how you might do that.
Would that be like if you generated this cold world, if you were, defiance disorder type person, you would try to make like a fortress that was like, you'd rekindle the fire magic and like make a fire fortress, and if you, I don't know, kill the cold wizard, it would change the world? Or
yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, how you open the kind of the open question, because we haven't messed with this enough yet, is how you open that initial door. Like, what is the piece of information? Of course, looking for lore and lost secrets, or meditating to get an inspiration or something. I mean, these are all valid ways to open the door. Talking to some kind of seer or something, and how you express your desire and then get it to react back. Of course, I mean, that's a huge question, how that might work, but that's just kind of what we're vaguely aiming for. And as usual, we'll aim at something and get something completely different, and then just kind of nudge it around until it's still a computer game or whatever.
All right.
Hopefully.
Well, we are towards the end of our hour. I think it's safe to say some of us will probably be in the chat to talk to people who have questions. And maybe we've been in the chat throughout this thing, talking to people. Who knows? We're time travelers now. But does anybody have any last pieces of advice for someone getting into it? You have 5 seconds. Go.
Procgen is turtles all the way down, so like pop up and think about that once in a while.
Turtles, got it. Anyone else?
I would say, like, I'm gonna try to do 5 seconds. When you do simulation, there's this temptation to like think you're being super objective, but you're in your choice of what to omit and exclude and emphasize, you're making kind of rhetorical decisions. So like keep in mind that simulation is kind of a tool of emphasis, almost more so than recreating reality.
I think if you're just getting started and want to explore, I think try to just do a couple relatively simple rules. Like, I think if you look at like that old Game of Life, it's fascinating how like only a couple rules can lead to such interesting behavior. So I think, it doesn't have to be an insurmountable thing. You could dive in, and adding is the fun part. Just add once you have something working.
Andy, Tarn, any last tips or observations or cautionary tales? I don't know.
Well, go right ahead.
I find you'll if you're doing procgen, it's probably likely that you're going to spend a lot of time implementing all these really cool situations that could occur. I find that I got more positive reactions when the game communicated that something was being generated, or rather like it's important. It's like a tree falls in the wood type situation. Like if you don't want to put a bunch of effort into something that people will never notice. So that's just my small little thing.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to try to generate whatever you want. And if during that process you find that maybe you should be handcrafting that thing instead, do that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and have an excellent rest of PAX. It's been great talking with you guys. Maybe we should have a chat offline sometime, because this was an amazing discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.